When we imagine prehistoric Earth, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Dinosaurs, right? Giant teeth, thunderous footsteps, and those massive creatures stomping through jungles. They've taken over books, documentaries, and childhood obsessions. But here's the twist. Dinosaurs were late to the party. Long before a single dinosaur roared or stomped, Earth was already alive. In fact, by the time the first dinosaurs showed up, life on this planet had already been around for billions of years. That's right, billions, not millions. Life didn't begin with dinosaurs. It began in boiling oceans, under volcanic skies, and in some of the most extreme environments you can imagine. So what was here before the dinosaurs? What creatures ruled the seas? When did life begin? And how did Earth go from a ball of molten rock to a planet full of crawling, swimming, and eventually walking things? In this video, we will look into the forgotten chapters of Earth's past, a time when life was tiny, strange, and unbelievably tough. Around 4.6 billion years ago, our sun was born, and like all births in space, it was a messy one. Leftover dust and gas swirled around the new star, colliding and clumping together. Tiny grains became pebbles, pebbles turned into boulders, and boulders crashed into each other to form bigger and bigger chunks. These chunks didn't stop growing until one of them became something very familiar to us, Earth. But don't picture green fields or blue skies just yet. This early Earth was a complete nightmare. It was a world covered in bubbling lava, blasted constantly by space rocks the size of cities. There was no air to breathe, no water to drink, and definitely no life. Instead, there was radioactive heat from inside the planet and nonstop chaos on the surface. Earth back then was more like a scene from a sci-fi disaster movie than the cozy blue planet we know today. And it stayed that way for a long time. For nearly a billion years, Earth was hot, violent, and inhospitable. But slowly, things began to change. Around 3.7 billion years ago, Earth started to cool. The surface calmed down just enough for water vapor to condense and rain to fall. That rain kept falling for thousands of years, eventually filling the deepest parts of the planet and forming Earth's first oceans. These oceans didn't look anything like the ones we have now. They were dark, stormy, and likely boiling in places, thanks to underwater volcanoes. Still, this was a turning point. The lava seas were retreating. The constant asteroid bombardment was slowing down. Earth was finally calming down just enough to become possible. Possible for what, exactly? Possible for life. That's right, life wasn't here yet. But now the stage was set. The planet finally had something close to a stable surface, oceans to mix things up, and a thick atmosphere, even if it was mostly toxic gases. It was still dangerous, but it was also full of raw potential. So what happened next? How do you go from a lifeless ocean to the first living thing? That's exactly where we're heading. Let's move into Earth's early waters and see how life began. Now that Earth had cooled down and oceans had formed, something extraordinary was about to happen. Deep beneath those stormy waves where heat and minerals bubbled up from cracks in the ocean floor, life began. Not big creatures with fins or legs, no, we're talking about something so tiny you couldn't see it with your eyes. Single-celled organisms. These were the first life forms, and they were incredibly simple. Think of them as microscopic bubbles with just enough inner machinery to feed, grow, and make copies of themselves. They didn't need oxygen to survive. In fact, they wouldn't have even wanted it. These were anaerobic bacteria, meaning they lived in places with no oxygen at all. For them, oxygen was toxic. For millions of years, these tiny cells were the only living things on Earth. They drifted in the oceans, multiplying slowly and feeding on the chemicals around them. It might not sound very exciting, but this was the start of everything. Every plant, animal, and human can trace their family tree all the way back to these ancient microbes. But then a few of these single-celled organisms did something no one else was doing. They began to photosynthesize. These were cyanobacteria, and they had a clever trick. They could use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to make energy. And as a byproduct, they released something that would change the entire planet: oxygen. At first, that oxygen built up in the oceans, reacting with minerals and forming rust on the seafloor. But eventually, it began to fill the atmosphere. This slow but steady process is known as the Great Oxygenation Event, and it was a big deal. For the first time, Earth's air began to contain oxygen, something future life would desperately need. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. For the anaerobic bacteria, this new gas was deadly. Many of them were wiped out or forced into oxygen-free corners of the planet, where some of their descendants still live today. But for life as we know it, oxygen was a game changer. The atmosphere was still far from perfect, and complex life hadn't arrived yet. But thanks to these tiny pioneers, Earth was becoming a place where more interesting things could happen. So what came after the bacteria? When did life get weird? You might think that once oxygen showed up, life would suddenly explode into action. But no, Earth had other plans. For almost 2 billion years, life stayed small. The planet was still ruled by microbes, those tiny single-celled organisms we met earlier. They kept floating in the oceans, quietly multiplying and slowly evolving, but nothing big or complex showed up yet. Why the delay? Well, even though oxygen was building up in the air, it didn't happen overnight. Earth had to go through a long, slow cleanup process. The oceans were full of iron and other materials that reacted with oxygen, so most of that oxygen got absorbed instead of building up in the atmosphere. Only after millions of years did oxygen finally start sticking around in the air. As this oxygen quietly transformed the planet, something else was happening on the surface. The land itself was shifting. Over time, Earth's continents began to drift and smash together, forming a massive supercontinent known as Rodinia. Imagine nearly all the land on Earth lumped into one gigantic, lonely mass. It sat near the equator, surrounded by endless ocean, and life, still microscopic, lived only in the water. This time in Earth's history wasn't flashy, but it was important. The oxygen levels kept rising, and the groundwork for complex life was being laid, and more suitable for something new. So when did life finally get creative? When did strange creatures start crawling, swimming? That turning point is just around the corner. Because what comes next is something scientists call an explosion. And no, it's not the kind with fire. It's the kind with teeth, eyes, shells, and a whole lot of mystery. After billions of years of mostly quiet evolution, Earth was ready for something big. And then boom, life exploded. Not literally, of course. The Cambrian explosion wasn't a giant blast, but it was a sudden, dramatic rise in the diversity of life. Compared to the slow pace before, this era felt like someone hit fast forward on evolution. But let's back up for a second. Just before this burst of life, the massive supercontinent Rodinia broke apart. As it split into smaller land masses, including a new one called Gondwana, the oceans around them became more varied and dynamic. That variety created new environments, new challenges, new opportunities, and more room for life to evolve. And evolve it did. For the first time ever, complex body parts began to appear. Eyes, limbs, hard shells, and jointed legs, features we now consider basic, were brand new back then. Animals were no longer just blobs floating around. Now they could see, move, hunt, and defend themselves. This is also when exoskeletons, hard outer shells, made their debut, giving protection and support to many early creatures. One of the most iconic animals from this time was the trilobite. It was a hard-shelled bug with many legs, scuttling along the ocean floor. Trilobites were everywhere. They ate plankton, scavenged the seafloor, and even hunted smaller prey. Their fossils are still found all over the world today, but they weren't alone. The first jawless fish appears, looking like slippery eels. One of the strangest was Uninozoan, a worm-like creature with a primitive spine, an early step toward vertebrates like us. Then there was Anomalocaris, whose name literally means strange shrimp. It was one of the ocean's first top predators. At around 30 centimeters long, it may not sound huge, but back then, it was a monster. It zipped through the water with flaps on its sides, snatching up softer animals with its spiny front arms. And we can't forget the wonderfully bizarre Pavania. This creature looked like someone doodled a squid and gave it a beak. It used its mouth to slurp up small prey, possibly the ancient version of popping open a can of Pringles. What made this period so special wasn't just the creatures. It was the complexity of how they interacted. For the first time, we see a full food chain take shape. Predators, Prey, scavengers, filter feeders, all playing their part. Life was no longer simple. It was a bustling underwater world full of activity, competition, and survival. And even though this explosion took millions of years, in evolutionary terms, it was a blink. The basic body plans we see today, head, tail, limbs, and eyes, were all established in this era. But just as life was picking up steam, something unexpected happened. A disaster, one that would wipe out many of these new creatures and clear the stage for the next chapter in Earth's story. Just when it seemed like life had found its groove, Earth cranked things up again. After the Cambrian explosion, the oceans got even busier. The Ordovician period brought another burst of diversity, this time called the Great Biodiversification Event. And yes, it was exactly what it sounds like, a wild boom in the variety of ocean life. New species popped up everywhere, especially in the seas. Some of them looked downright terrifying. There were the Eurypterids, or what scientists like to call sea scorpions. These creatures weren't actually scorpions, but they sure looked the part, with spiky claws, long tails, and armored bodies. Some grew over 1.5 meters long. Imagine swimming next to that. But they weren't the top dogs of the ocean. That title belonged to creatures like the Camarasaurus, giant squid-like predators with long, cone-shaped shells. They could reach lengths of up to 7 meters. Using their sharp beaks, they hunted Eurypterids and other sea creatures with ease. At the same time, early coral reefs began to form, creating brand new ecosystems filled with trilobites, shellfish, and primitive fish wearing thick armor instead of scales. While all this action was happening underwater, something quiet and game-changing was taking place on land. The first land plants had arrived. These were humble, moss-like organisms that clung close to water. They didn't have roots or flowers or even proper stems, but they were the first living things to set foot, well, cells, on solid ground. And they may have accidentally triggered a disaster. As these simple plants spread across damp land, they began absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That might sound like a good thing, but Earth's balance is delicate. With less CO2 to trap heat, global temperatures started to drop. Glaciers grew, oceans cooled, and soon, Earth slipped into an ice age. The result? Mass extinction. Around 80% of marine species vanished, including many that had just evolved. Cold waters, falling sea levels, and changing chemistry wiped out entire ecosystems. It was Earth's first major biological reset. But even in disaster, life finds a way. Some species managed to survive, and as the ice melted and the world warmed up again, evolution would step back in, with more surprises in store. After the deep freeze of the Ordovician, the Earth finally began to thaw. The Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted, and sea levels began to rise once again. It was like the planet took a long icy breath and then slowly exhaled. As the waters warmed, life that had barely survived started to bounce back. Coral reefs, which had taken a big hit during the extinction, came roaring back to life. They spread across the shallow seas, creating vibrant underwater neighborhoods full of shelter and food. These reefs became home to all sorts of sea creatures, including some familiar faces: trilobites, shellfish, and now jawed fish. Yes, you read that right. Fish got an upgrade. Until now, fish had been jawless and eel-like, but during the Silurian, they developed movable jaws. It was a game changer. Jaws meant they could bite, chew, and hunt with much more power. This kicked off a new stage in the underwater arms race. Not to be outdone, sea scorpions, Eurypterids, grew even larger. Some reached up to 2 meters long and ruled the ocean like armored tanks. These predators prowled the reefs, snapping at anything that got too close. But the big surprise? Life was starting to move onto land. The first brave pioneers were simple plants and creepy crawly arthropods. Think millipedes, scorpions, and early spiders. They didn't stray too far from the water, though. At first, they still relied on moisture to breathe and survive. That's where plants stepped up. Some of them evolved vascular stems and internal systems that could hold and move water. That might sound small, but it was a huge leap. It meant plants could grow taller, stay upright, and spread farther from the shore. Earth was beginning to turn green. And with more land being claimed by life, the stage was being set for even more dramatic changes. Because up next comes the period where fish grow massive, forests appear, and vertebrates take their first bold steps onto dry ground. Let's move to the Devonian, aka the Age of Fishes. This era saw an explosion in fish diversity, unlike anything before it. For the first time, the seas were filled with creatures that looked like real hunters. Sleek swimmers, powerful jaws, and thick armor plates, evolution had truly gone into overdrive. One of the most fearsome fish of all time appeared during this period, Dunkleosteus. It wasn't just big, it was a swimming tank. This armored giant could grow over 8 meters long with a head full of bone-crushing plates instead of teeth. Its jaws could snap shut with the force of a crocodile, only stronger. If you were a Devonian fish, you definitely didn't want to end up in Dunkleosteus's mouth. But the oceans weren't just full of bone-headed beasts. Early sharks also began to show up, smaller, quicker, and built more like the ones we know today. While they weren't the top predators just yet, they were clearly rising stars in the food chain. Back on land, something just as amazing was happening. The first true forest began to grow. Tall trees, complete with complex root systems and branches, started to rise above the mossy ground. These weren't like modern oaks or pines, but they were leafy and tall enough to cast shade and shape entire ecosystems. For the first time, Earth had something close to a landscape. And it wasn't just the plants making moves. Some animals were now venturing out of the water for good. One of the most famous is Tiktaalik, a strange fish with both fins and features that look suspiciously like limbs. It could haul itself up onto mudflats, breathing air when needed. Another step forward was Ichthyostega, an early tetrapod, a four-limbed vertebrate. It was clumsy on land but better than anything before it. These were the first animals with bones strong enough to support their weight outside the water. Meanwhile, insects and arachnids were spreading across the land. Creatures like primitive millipedes, spiders, and early wingless bugs scurried among the growing plants. Life was clearly getting braver and bolder, but then the Devonian story took a dark turn. As trees grew taller, their deep roots broke apart rocks in the soil. Rain washed that nutrient-rich soil into rivers and oceans, feeding massive blooms of algae. These algae used up oxygen in the water, leaving marine life gasping, literally. This triggered a massive extinction event. Entire groups of marine animals, trilobites, sea scorpions, and placoderms were wiped out. It's estimated that up to 70% of marine invertebrate species have vanished. Once again, Earth was hit with a reminder. Even plants can cause destruction. Still, not everything was lost. Life kept moving forward. Forests held strong, and some of those brave tetrapods would go on to change everything. Next, we enter a world thick with trees, towering insects, and a new kind of egg that would forever change life on land. Welcome to the Carboniferous period. If you stepped into the Carboniferous period, you'd find yourself in a completely different world. One where swampy forests stretched as far as the eye could see, and the air was thick with moisture and oxygen. In fact, oxygen levels were at an all-time high, much higher than today. And this lush green planet was packed with trees, ferns, and mosses so large and dense they looked like nature had gone overboard. And that rich oxygen, it did something incredible. It supercharged insects. The Carboniferous was home to giant bugs, no exaggeration. Imagine a dragonfly the size of a hawk. That's Meganeura, with a wingspan reaching nearly 75 centimeters. On the ground, Arthropleura crawled through the leaf litter like a massive armored centipede, stretching up to 2.5 meters long. Thankfully, these millipedes were vegetarians. Still, walking through these forests probably felt like stepping into a prehistoric sci-fi jungle. At the same time, the animal kingdom was making serious moves. Amphibians, which had evolved from early tetrapods, became some of the dominant creatures on land and in water. They had legs, lungs, and a love-hate relationship with dry ground, still tied to water for laying eggs and staying moist, but slowly learning how to live away from it. Then came a game changer, a leap so big it would shape the future of all land animals, the amniotic egg. This new kind of egg had a protective shell and its own little environment inside, almost like a self-contained life pod. It kept the developing embryo safe and moist, even far from water. For the first time, animals didn't need to return to ponds or swamps to reproduce. They could live, hunt, and reproduce entirely on land. These animals were called amniotes, and they're important because they're our ancestors. From these early amniotes, two major branches split off. One group would eventually become reptiles and birds. The other group, they'd slowly evolve into mammals. Every lizard, eagle, and human owes something to these tough, egg-laying pioneers. As the forests thrived and land life flourished, Earth seemed like it had hit its stride. Before the first dinosaur ever hatched, life had already been through billions of years of trial and error. Earth went from a molten fireball to a watery world. Tiny single-celled organisms quietly built the foundation for everything that came after. Oceans teemed with bizarre creatures, some with shells, some with armor, some with jaws that could crush bone. Life crawled onto land, took its first breath of air, and began to stretch toward the sky. So the next time someone says life began with dinosaurs, you'll know better. If you find this video enjoyable, let us know in the comment section the part that shocked you the most.